Okay, ready? Whenever you're ready, you go ahead.
I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. One of our invited speakers is Jaimie Roy. She is a senior English major who is graduating in May and has another really wonderful event coming up in June. Jaimie has been extremely persistent in her education, and I am delighted that she submitted this wonderful paper that we are able to showcase at the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swartz, for introducing me. I want to say, just as much as I've been working hard in my education, Dr. Swartz has been a pivotal part of that. My paper is called Appalachia Guided by Literature. Throughout history, there has been a manipulation of facts to better suit the foundations of common belief in our society. History has been manipulated to better suit the powers of this nation, and propaganda directed toward the people of the Appalachians is at the forefront of the manipulation. America prides itself on the freedom it maintains and the protection of civil liberties of its population. However, this was not the case for the coal miners that lived in the Appalachian region. If economic and political endeavors of corporations and large companies clash with the founding laws, it is most certainly the latter that suffer. It is only now that we truly understand the gravity of the effects of the industrial era on the untouched mountains that stretch across from the U.S., particularly the most ancient range that stretches from Maine to Georgia, and the area of that range rich in coal that encompasses West Virginia, parts of Kentucky, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Helen Lewis's colonialism model will discuss the causes of structural change and how it comes about, the ways that power is used to create or prohibit and to control a just society. Lewis's model answers questions such as, can political power be used to control economic power? Can I just start from where I was? Okay, as well as other theories that will help to interpret the scientific and geographical explanations of the effects of coal mining on the community in these areas. Although these are important aspects of the crisis regarding the region in a number of disciplines, it is the vessel of Denise Gardenia's novels that will prove most helpful in endeavoring to explore the world of Appalachia and its mountain people. Literature can speak volumes about the injustices faced by the economic and political powers of the American coal companies that raped the region, the effects of outside ownership of these companies, and the ways in which mining was a subsidiary of the industrialists who owned large interests in iron and steel manufacturing. Although a statistical analysis supports the facts regarding the coal wars of West Virginia and Kentucky, it is the novels that will breathe life into what it was like for the people of the isolated mountain world. Not only does Denise Gardenia develop awareness of what the people endured during this time of change as supposed progress came to the region, but also how it altered the course of the Appalachian region and the well-being of its people. In Gardenia's related novel, Storming Heaven and the Unquiet Earth, we will explore the 5 stages of Helen Lewis's colonialism model in 4 main categories as follows: economic injustice, political manipulation, social unrest, and finally, environmental consequences pertaining to coal mining and the mining camps. The exact geographical area of the Appalachian region is open for debate. However, geographically, it is considered to be a 205,000 square mile area that spans the spine of the Appalachian Mountains from southern New York to northern Mississippi. This is harsh terrain with rocky and extreme seasons of extremely low temperatures in the winter and record high temperatures in the summer. As a result of the mountainous terrain, good farmland is scarce, and people that live here endured social isolation and financial problems. Helen Lewis remarks about the contrast of the region's abundant resources and the financial disparity that the people face in her colonialism model. Lewis states, "The Southern Appalachians is a region of great contrasts. In an area with great wealth and mineral resources, an area which produces $1.5 billion worth of coal in a year, one finds great poverty, substandard housing, hunger, and poor health." According to Lewis, this is due to the fact of incentives for investment, inability of the population to make investment in the region that would allow for greater economic parity of the people, and a population that includes very little skilled labor. The mountainous terrain, which isolates the people from one another, also isolates them from those places that could offer education, trade, or apprenticeship. And those who obtain education, skills, and prosperity still face prejudice for remaining in the area. Because of the need for families to survive, employment opportunities were limited. Employers owned housing and maintained company stores that were the only options for purchasing necessary items. And miners were paid in scrip, which could be redeemed only at those stores and to pay rent. In this way, the company may not only controlled the workers economically, but also limited other opportunities for employment. Medical care was also provided by the company, as doctors were primarily employed by the company. Bringing health care to a region where residents are far apart and where companies owned and provided local doctors and nursing care practitioners who bent to the bidding of those owners when treating miners who often suffer from mining accidents and black lung, and treating their families for problems related to the economics of the family, diseases and conditions that result from poor diet, unsafe living conditions, and poor sanitation. Healthcare has not been trusted. Local medical personnel are mistrusted because they provide services for miners or country people, and therefore inadequate service, for they too are opportunists or exploiters. Those practitioners whose work and lives are dedicated to people's care are often constrained by lack of equipment or supplies, causing the health care in an area to be substandard. Those who earn an income may go to 100 to 300 miles out of their way to seek medical attention. Those who cannot pay are the ones who seek medical care locally, and therefore the doctors and nurses who had remained in the area often fulfilled the prophecy of poor care by their opportunists. If one cannot survive on their skill due to their choice and location, they will either move or find a way to manipulate the situation. The opinion is that they are no good, or they would go elsewhere. Historically, the economics of Appalachia relied solely on the land that had been passed down from generation, as well as skills such as hunting, canning, and pickling in order to prepare for the winter months. Inheriting the land from family meant that children also learned how to survive through these means and therefore needed very little education. In fact, many left school to work on the farms as soon as their bodies were formed by the physical labor, and school sessions reflected the need for children to be at home working before those children left school altogether. For many years, the isolation of the area was of some protection to the people. But timbering like that described in Gardenia's Storming Heaven, and then incursions into the mountain that allowed rail transportation and the mineral riches of the region left the people living with this isolation and little education vulnerable to exploitation. Land was often taken by deceit, trick, or murder. Denise Gardenia's novel, Storming Heaven, highlights these injustices through C.J. Markham's grandfather, who is one of the few that refused the proposal by the railroad company to give up his mineral rights. He explains to the company that he holds a deed at the courthouse, and the representative of the company replies, "Junior patent," they kept saying. "Senior patent is what we own. That takes precedence. Ask any judge." The judges we was supposed to ask was as far off as the judges we was supposed to ask was a way far off, so many folks signed. After standing his ground, the situation takes a turn for the worst when CJ's grandfather is killed while he is farming. shot in the back of the head like an execution. Although it is never clear who took the shot, it is without a doubt that he was killed over the land and because of his refusal to sign away his rights. Soon after he is laid to the rest, the sheriff comes to take the land, claiming that he, CJ's grandfather, signed the deed over which the whole family knew was false but could not prove. This could have led to violence had the family been given a target for their outrage because of the injustice. However, the company cleverly used the people of the region to carry out the evictions. Whether it was due to threats or bribery, the lack of financial flow created civilians like the sheriff who lived in the region all of his life and knew the community well, but acted in the interests of the companies for his own financial gain and personal power. CJ relates, "I wanted to kill him. He was the same man I had known all my young life. Omar Kane from Justice Town, who gave me a molasses candy when Papa went to the polls to vote. I wanted to get my squirrel rifle and shoot him." This is a carefully designed strategy that was used to prevent revolt from the mountain people and to displace outrage. The company would use the townsmen to carry out their theft of the land, and in turn the townsmen would be given money or other benefits to turn on their own kinsmen. In turn, the railroad sold the deeds of land they acquired and sold it to the coal company in Gardenia's book. The American Coal Company to ensure the ability to travel to the Appalachians to remove the coal from the mountains. After the residents are wrongfully evicted from their homes, there was a large displacement of long-term landowners who had nowhere to turn and no other way of making a living for their families and themselves other than working in the mines. We wasn't sure where to go. Some folks had left for Kentucky or Tennessee to look for farms to buy there. But most was living makeshift until the new coal camps was built. The men was promised jobs cutting the timber, putting up the houses, and then working the mines. Ironically, most of the families were pushed out of their homes only to return to the land to strip it of its natural resources and beauty for the very companies who displaced them. Lewis explains that the structural change of the lives of the people of this region of Appalachia comes about in the form of control through external ownership of great wealth. Dominant outside industries establish control, exploit the region, and maintain domination and subjugation of the region. In Storming Heaven, this is the beginning of the Appalachians' domination through the American Coal Company, and it changes the entire region forever. After claiming control of the land and the people, the company goes a step further to maintain the control of its workers by leasing the newly built houses to them. This housing is on company land, and any miner who steps out of line can be evicted by the company. This encourages the people to cooperate fully with the company and prevents the miners from having a say about any aspect of their work lives. The balance is fully tilted in the favor of the company, and if a member chooses not to comply with any regulation or to show distaste in any way, they can lose not only their jobs, but also the homes they live in. Without credit at the company store or any cash to move from the area, for another way the companies maintain this control is by giving payment to the workers in the form of script that was only of any value in the company store in order to starve out any competitive prices from the region established stores. A character emphasizes this point in the novel Storming Heaven. "Them miners can't trade with me no ways. They get paid in that company money. Got to trade at the company score. Script they call it." This prevents anyone other than the company from benefiting from the coal mining and only allows for the economic flow to be managed through the company. This hinders the workers from any kinds of savings so that they are left at the company's mercy without any promise of ever owning their own land ever again or having any ability to improve their condition. This continues the cycle with their children, who eventually have no other option than to either leave their homeland or work in some way for the company. Although the people had very little in the way of finance and politics before the companies arrived, Shannon Elizabeth Bell argues in her article, the destruction of social capital in West Virginia, that they were wealthy in aspects of social constructs. Many residents argue that coal's influence in the local and state politics of West Virginia has allowed the industry to engage in highly destructive and unjust mining practices that have destroyed the safety and livelihoods of many residents living in the southern coal-producing region of the state. I argue that in addition to these, there is another visible cost of coal: damage to social landscape of coal-field communities. She goes on to say that they destroyed the social capital of the region, which is essential to the community's ability to engage in collective action to fight injustices. She explains that social capital is much different than economic or political influence. It is the tangible and intangible resources, not through their personal human capital, but through their social interactions and connections with others. In fact, both novels portray the kinship that people feel towards one another. The Bell theorizes has been stripped from these people, directly linked to the coal industry's influence over the area. The three factors of social capital are social trust, networks, and social norms. Social trust is the concept of a like-minded society with mutual goals in mind working together. This ensures trust among townspeople and lessens the need for third parties, such as law enforcement, to protect the community. Trust is important to community because it promotes collaboration even without rewards or penalties. Networks are also part of this social capital and regard all organizations such as church, school, teams, and even informal social groups that are interconnected through families and friends. Networks increase the flow of information and facilitate communication through the regions that are isolated or geographically hindering. Finally, social norms allow the social capital to facilitate a type of rule that is generally oral and based upon social sanctions of the community. Without social norms, they are disconnected from one another and feel no reciprocity within or toward the community. Strong reciprocity allows for concerns for others' well-being and may include action for those concerns. The kind of interaction that had taken place when townspeople and small farmers interacted, helping each other with tasks and looking out for the well-being of members of their communities, were the strength of the region until lumbering and coal mining came to the region. The coal industry prevented any unauthorized congregation of large groups, even employing pastors of churches favorable to the community, and suffocate the social networks and trust by displacing the goals of the community. As a direct result, the social capital of the region dwindled, and with it, the ability to engage in collective action to fight injustices such as these. Gardenia's books demonstrate the rise and fall of reciprocity and concern for others by telling the story of industrialization coming to the region, the loss of land and customary interaction, and the rise and fall of coal workers' union, the benefits and hardships of life in the region, and worsening political and social concerns as strip mining and mountaintop removal mining became more important in the coal fields. Along with the loss of influence and communication that social capital offered, the townspeople also faced prejudices due to their small town lifestyle and minimal education that Gardenia demonstrates in her novel Storming Heavens. Stories promulgated by coal companies and by outsiders who entered the region to help. The people who needed money to get their projects going told the outside world of the recklessness, lawlessness, and brutality of the mountain residents, overturning in some ways the older story of rugged independence that had characterized the region earlier. Result of land grants to those who fought in the Revolutionary War. Ian C. Hartman's article, Appalachian Anxiety, Race, Gender, and the Paradox of Purity, discusses the prejudices that developed from 1873 to 1901 that were in stark contrast with one another. Appalachian at one conjures the contradictory, competing, and irreconcilable images of poor and debased white trash hillbillies, on the other hand, and the frontier masculinity and heroic independence of figures such as Daniel Boone and David Crockett on the other hand. Theodore Roosevelt also expresses the contradictory views of Appalachians in this trilogy, The Winning of the West. The third installment discusses his disgust for the region, calling the people ragged creatures living in poverty, ignorance, and dirt. It is because of these prejudices that people are given very little empathy and understanding. Although many sources and groups spread stories of violent and uneducated hillbillies, in large part of the characterization of the people of the region comes directly from propaganda spread by outside colonial interests. As Helen Lewis notes, exploiters blame any problems the domination causes on the ignorance or deficiencies of the Appalachian people. The company men that came to oversee the coal companies established the upper echelons of power among the newly formed coal towns. Others settled in the area to benefit from the new circulation of company money and were made up of such groups as doctors, storekeepers, and officials who intended to benefit from their towns. They brought with them the concepts of common prejudices held by pivotal men such as Theodore Roosevelt regarding those in the region, expecting them to be lazy and educated barbarians. When the miners and their families complained of their living conditions, these people saw them as weak and lazy, but capable of being controlled. With the discrimination Appalachians faced, they were and still are subjugated to unneeded death and harm, as the attitudes towards them continues to be prevalent in many areas. The company have seen and still sees these workers as replaceable, and they are undervalued. Companies have gone so far as to refuse them the sanitary conditions to live properly. Storming Heaven provides a perfect example of these attitudes when an outbreak of typhoid occurs, and Carrie Bishop, a nurse in the coal fields, tells her brother Miles, who has been a company man and boss after attending Berea College, what needs to be done. I've been looking around. The privies is built over the creek, and that's where most folks gets their water. With this many folks living cramped together, you got to build new privies, deep ones, and treat them with chemicals. Miles, who like Carrie grew up near where the mine is located, considered his sister's proposal and knows that the company will not put the time and money into such a necessary endeavor. They're talking a new tipple. Privies or plumbing would take some money. Although it was doubtful he would gain any positive results, he wrote a letter to the company head, who lived in Philadelphia, and asked for help to better their sanitary facilities. Miles was told there was no money in the budget for such frills. Such frills, as they are considered, would help prevent a deadly disease from wreaking havoc on their workmen and endangering the lives of their families. This attitude is reality in the Appalachians, where protection against disease, something that the country has the ability to prevent, is denied to them. However, the company is willing to spend money in their budget to enhance profit margins without a raised gain or even proper medical benefits to the miners they employ. When outsiders were not blaming the mountain people for their inadequacies, they were expecting to reform them to natural society by making them civilized and creating awareness about these conditions that were blamed on their own ignorance and laziness. Awareness of their situation brings people to regard the Appalachians in the same manner. We would regard any third world country that we would need to help change. This means changes imposed rather than asked for. For groups and initiatives have come into the area making changes without consideration for those for who they are or what the people might want done. An example of this is that during this novel, Storming Heaven, Carrie Bishop is invited to her teacher's home, a teacher in her nursing classes who has moved to the area in order to help this impoverished and uneducated lot. Carrie describes her experience with Miss Radcliffe. She served the cookies on bone white china, and we had hot tea served in delicate cups with handles so small that even a child could not get a proper grip without being burned. Miss Radcliffe talked about the importance of an education, about how we had the obligation to raise ourselves above our parents and save our mountain people from ignorance. She reminded us that Abraham Lincoln has been as poor as we were. Miss Radcliffe's supposedly encouraging speech actually places these children below others with the understanding that they somehow need to rise above their heritage rather than accept it. This concept is highlighted in Lewis's model and what she calls the culture of poverty model. Miss Radcliffe's objective is to change the values of the poor and assimilate them into the middle class or greater culture. By doing this to the youth, the changes will trickle down to the society as a whole. Unfortunately, this only exacerbates the situation and creates a divide between the residents and the outsiders. The mountain people who have learned to survive in a difficult terrain with farming tactics fit among society as the tiny plates and saucers fit with the world of survival they come from. Not only is this condescending, but also ironic, because had it not been for people like Miss Radcliffe and the companies that brought the civilized world to the Appalachian doorstep, these children would live a life that is at the very least in their control, fulfilled by their farms and homes without the imminent violence, illness, and death that coal mining brings to their doorstep. They would not have had as much as some economically, but they would not be suffering from unsanitary conditions and a gloomy future as second-class citizens living in their lives in a dark hole or a filthy and unsanitary mining camp. This is not just a passing concept, one that has not lingered, for throughout the history of the companies moving into the Appalachians, attitudes brought condescension or pity as attitudes toward the mountain people. Carrie's niece, Rachel, and Rachel's daughter, Jackie, are also subject to these attitudes in the novel Unquiet Earth. When a new crew arrives to film a small shoe company's generous gift of shoes they had not been able to sell, and so were distributing to these poor souls, Jackie raises her hand to tell the nice television man, "Some of us don't need them." She says this partly because she is irritated by the treatment of herself and her classmates, as though she was in dire need of deliverance from her circumstances, when in fact she is relatively well off, as her mother is also a nurse. In taking the part of her classmates who were poor because the wealthy pockets of the companies who came to exploit the region's faults were filled at the expense of these families' income. The angry reporter asks how many need the shoes. No one raises their hand. Jackie notes that lots of them do need the shoes, but they would rather have their tongues pulled out than say so. This sense of independence and pride is met with coercion, for when the announcer asks who wants to be on television, everyone raises his or her hand, including Jackie. Everyone accepts the shoes so that they can be on television. Lewis considers this kind of exploitation and imposition when she explains that various programs of social network, education, and psychiatry are designed to change attitudes, to motivate and to assimilate, rather than making people proud and giving them agency. According to Lewis, it is inevitable that colonized people will rebel against the colonizers. As Lewis's statement indicates, the novel depicts the vulnerability yet rebellious attitude of the mountain people. You know what the old fox says? Fox says, "Poor chicken, he was looking puny anyhow." Then he eats the chicken for supper. Colonial attitudes are detrimental to society in many ways. The attitudes and beliefs of the others who believe they know what the people of an area need better than the people themselves can prevent new and higher paying jobs from coming in, hinder social connections, and change the way in which an individual views her or himself. As if this is not enough, anarchy and rebellion go hand in hand with oppression. The attitudes towards the people allow others to justify not only their oppression, but the violence against those people when they attempt to fight back. Social injustices turn to political injustices when the coal miners take a stand against the American Coal Company. The lack of decent pay, long and hard hours of labor, and dangerous working conditions create civil unrest. The coal miners' union starts to develop, and with it, violence takes precedence. The struggle to unionize the mines was a long process that stretched more than 40 years and included 2 mine wars. The company does not want the miners to hold them accountable for their actions and prevent them to the highest amount of revenue. So union membership is forbidden and is cause for firing and eviction, or more. In order for the members to join the union, they must do so in secrecy, but it takes one member who knows But it only takes one member who knows who the members are to tip off management of union members. Joining was very risky for the coal miners, and as one character says of his induction into the union, I repeated the words after him. I pledged I would not reveal the names of union members to the boss, that I would not take the job of a striker, and that I would cease work when called to do so, that I would never wrong a brother or see him wronged. The others hesitated. The hesitation is to join is due to the heavy consequences if they were found out. As I noted, they can be fired from the company, their family instantly kicked out of their makeshift home, and they would have no savings, be cut from the food and goods they need from the company store, and have no recourse that would allow them to take care of their families or themselves. The company has all of the control, and the miners are so expendable that even when violence toward the miners occurs, everyone looks the other way. With the company town come the company guards, Pinkerton and Baldwin Felts agents who outweigh the law in their power and corruption. The miners are at the mercy of these brutes and become a target as soon as they become a member of the union. During the novel, a black union leader and organizer who has been discovered as such of the company is thrown into the furnace by company thugs. Randall Lloyd is witness to his death, says, "An orange sheet of flame belched from the furnace. Johnson's head fell back. I met his eyes. I knew he did not see me, that he was ripping his soul from his body and soaring away with it. And before I'll be a slave," they tossed him inside the furnace and slammed the door. Although you can read statistics about the many deaths from mining, living in mining campus brutality, and the harsh living conditions of miners and their families, it is hard to imagine in living color without reading through the eyes of torment. Gardenia brings the violence to life through all of the wild suffering and pain in her novels that is needed to better understand the sacrifices made in order to become a member of the union and protect themselves from company abuse of power. The amount of violence escalates. Storming Heaven describes a shootout with the gun thugs who had decided to evict townspeople of Justice, a town not owned by the company, although some residents work in the mines, from their homes. Justice had declared itself free of the companies and the actions of the Baldwin Felts agents, and some of the main characters, the mayor and the sheriff of the town, decided they would take matters into their own hands and send them away. They refused to serve the eviction notices or allow the Baldwin Felts agents to move the people's furniture onto the street. Unfortunately, a shooting broke out, and both sides injured casualties, including the town's mayor, the sheriff, and a lay pastor. We arraigned for court and a trial date set. The morning of trial, as the men were climbing the steps to enter the courthouse, Carrie, the wife of Albion Freeman, tells that the Baldwins stepped forward, pulling guns from inside their vests. When I cried a warning, the guns grew larger. The noise they made filled the whole world. Her husband Albion and sheriff lie dead on the courthouse steps. The men who exact revenge are never even reprimanded for the shootings. The truth is that many women like Carrie Bishop lost their husbands and brothers in their coal mining wars. If not in the services of the coal companies themselves, and this incident is based on the massacre at Matewan, West Virginia, and the trial of Sheriff Sid Hatfield, and another of the men involved at Matewan. These mine wars ended in bloodshed and death, creating a larger divide between both the miners and the companies. Both Storming Heaven and The Unquiet Earth document the bloodshed in the coal fields. Gardenia's graphic description of the Battle of Blair Mountain in Storming Heaven exemplifies the government's complicity and manipulation in the protection of powerful and corporate coal companies. President Harding sent 2,500 troops and 14 bombing planes to end the rebellion of the West Virginia miners. Despite the fact that making war on its own citizens is prohibited in the United States. In his book, Bloodletting in Appalachia, Howard Lee, a former Attorney General of West Virginia, blames the miners for lawbreaking and treason. However, Lee points out that many of the defendants in the treason trials were either not indicated or freed primarily because the trials were moved out of Logan County, where Sheriff Don Logan actively worked on his own and the mine owners' interests. In the new venue, General Bill Blizzard was acquitted of any wrongdoing. Lee says Blizzard's acquittal greatly alarmed the operators, who responded by the operators' hiring of people, including some pastors, to spread anti-union propaganda. And he admits that these poison campaign bore its expected fruit. Widespread prejudice against all of the defendants that carried as well outside of the region. Lee points out that treason was charged because the miners were levying war against the state of West Virginia and its constituted authorities. Don Chafin and his army of Baldwin-Fest gun thugs, state police, and federal troops were the apparent winners of the battle. But he notes and quotes that if the federal troops had not arrived when they did, the outcome would have been very different. And he quotes mine workers Vice President Philip Murray as stating that the citizens' army was making steady advance into the camp of the enemy until the federal troops arrived. Lee notes that while the actions were treason, it is doubtful if a dozen participants in the march understood that they were fighting the sovereign state. And all would have resented the imputation that they were guilty of treason in their minds. They were fighting the hated mine guards and for their constitutional and statutory rights. Not only the companies exploiting the miners and their families, but the government stripped them of their civil liberties. Currently, after being placed on the National Record of Historic Places, Blair Mountain has lost that historic designation. And despite an ongoing fight to protect the history in the mountain itself, Blair Mountain is targeted by mountaintop removal mining. Meanwhile, during the strikes, the coal miners and their families are evicted from the crude homes they were originally paid to build and left at the mercy of civil activists and the Red Cross, who provided food and water as well as tents for the people to live in to endure the winter. Many died of pneumonia and poor living conditions, but Carrie Bishop remarks how these deaths are the same amount as they endured when the men were mining under the poor working conditions, not to mention the families' living conditions with the privies and typhoid. Carrie has gone into the tent colony with her husband Albion, later killed on the courthouse steps. She provides nursing care for the striking workers and their families. One little girl has frostbitten feet, and Carrie takes her to the hospital. She runs into her brother, who is now the superintendent of the mine, who takes her to get something to eat because, as he notes, she is half starved. He buys her a blue plate special, and while she eats, talks with her, trying to get her to abandon the strikers. He speaks of the miners in patriarchal colonial terms as his people. To which Carrie responds, "No, but your people, as you call them, still ain't got money for food. And they ain't your people, Miles. They ain't your kin. They are their own people." Summing up the agency of Appalachians to act in their own best interests when fighting against colonialism and exploitation, as Lewis points out, and the co-option possible when Appalachians are used to make it appear that local and not outside sources are being served. Economic issues trickle down and become political issues when the wealthy have an incentive for certain people to be voted into office, because they will ensure the careful control they, the wealthy and out-of-area owners, have over the region. The Republicans got their votes when the operators looked over the shoulders of the miners in the voting booths. Irma's crowd took in everybody else by promising a school board for Cousin Myrtle, or threatening a busted still for Brother Otis, or buying votes. Nobody ever talked about getting back the land. It was just grab this, grab that. This manipulation of political rights shows how far the companies would go to ensure their subjugation of the mountain people. And the greater the amount of money they have, the easier it is for them to buy their way into politics, both local and outside the region. In fact, in The Unquiet Earth, Arthur Lee Sizemore receives more money than he thought he would be offered for votes in the Kennedy-Nixon run for the presidency. The political climate of the state and individual regions prevents the coal mining communities from passing laws that would allow them to ensure help from the government. The early War on Poverty programs tried to create political action. Such action was frightening to the local power structure and to the corporate interests. These programs have been co-opted or dropped. Gardenia demonstrates this in The Unquiet Earth, when the Vista worker Tom helps to organize a cooperative run by Hasselday and his sister-in-law Lou Ellie. The co-op is a direct threat to mine supervisor Arthur Lee Sizemore's supermarket, and the co-op cannot get permission to accept food stamps. For a time after buying shares in the supermarket, food stamps are allowed. But then the Vista worker Tom is arrested for treason and taken out of the area. Eventually, the co-op has to close. As Lewis points out, allowing for the companies to offer the lowest wages possible without competition from government help keeps the company power intact, as does interfering with the mission of Vista, which has been designed to make the people of Appalachia self-actualizing. The lifestyle before the companies were in power was not one of great wealth. In fact, most of the people had was their land and their freedom, but not much else. They had the ability to care for one another, but lacked basic education and skills. They valued tradition and kinship, but had very little money and required very little to live, which is the main reason there was very little fight against the economic changes that came with strip mining and mountaintop removal mining. However, this domination brought with it a sacrifice in general freedoms with company officials and enforcements of camp laws. Unions were strictly forbidden and become the forefront in rebellions in the novels. Violence and oppression was commonplace and left the locals with very little protection outside of one another. Despite the connections of kinship and respect towards the land that the Appalachian people have observed for centuries, the environment is destroyed by the stripping of the coal in the region. Considerations that the novel describes above are water contamination, global warming, and deforestation that need to be considered. Due to the mining, the surface was impacted by the amount of metals in the soil that were transferred to the surface, which caused higher metal toxicity levels, leaving contamination in the water supply for wildlife and human consumption. At the time, the local mining area in the 1850s forward, no one was aware of these factors, which meant that there were years of contamination that was not regulated nor prevented. According to Paul D. Thackeray in his article, Methane Reduction Aids Air Quality, the amount of methane pockets under the surface that exploded and killed many workers also polluted the air supply, in turn creating higher levels of greenhouse gases that affect the seasons and add to global warming. Lastly, as depicted in the novels, the land is stripped of forests not only for the profit in timber brought, but also to make way for the housing needed because of a population increase directly correlated to the new coal mining towns, as well as the need for wood for support beams through the tunnel systems of deep mining. Current practices of mountaintop removal mining, in which fill is dumped into the valleys, covers the steam heads, causes contamination of the water, flooding, and erosion of the land on which the clear-cut forest stood. As Harry Caudill so famously said, after industry is done and supposed reclamation is begun, it is like putting lipstick on a corpse. Gardenia's second book ends with a slightly fictionalized account of the Buffalo Creek disaster that killed 127 and destroyed 1,200 homes and towns along the flood route. Failure of a slate dam was blamed for the disaster. Slate had been thrown into the hollow with no foundation. Heavy rains caused the dams to fail and flood the valley that the creek ran through. Pitson Coal, the company responsible for the dams, called the flood an act of God, although nothing could be more godlike. Such dams still exist in West Virginia and frighten residents with the possibility of repeat of this flood. In one case, the community where Marsh Creek Elementary School is located, after a long fight on the part of citizens, the mining company is building a new school not located directly down the hillside from the dam. Deforestation causes environmental issues that are dangerous for wildlife and human populations. Landslides cause insurmountable damage to the soil, stripping it of nutrients and preventing later farming or growth to come back for decades. Also, the destruction of habitat devastates the indigenous species of Appalachian life and depletes natural food supplies. Most of all, it discourages morale and leaves empty gaps in the hearts of people that knew the area as it once was. Changing the natural beauty of daily life can change the morale of those who live there, making their conditions seem hopeless and desperate. The exploitation of natural resources and the abuse of land were just as detrimental as the company's manipulation of the people. The connection that these people had with the land spans the generation of families who took care of it. But that is not all. They also see themselves as part of the Appalachians in a social construct. Christopher A. Cooper explains in his article, Geography of Appalachian Identity. Given controversies over definitions of Appalachia, we focus on the social process of regional identity to develop a better understanding of Appalachia. The land suffered deforestation that is geographically described in Giardinia's novel, Storming Heaven, as C.J. Markham muses. One day in the springtime, Irma took me on the new train to Justice-town. Lumberjacks had shaved the mountain's sides for 15 miles, sliced the trees into boards or strewn them about in tangled heaps. The bushes was growed up, the flanks of the hill gashed and sticky with mud. At the mouth of Markham's branch, long stone buildings rose from the oozing ground, and on the ridge where the Markham Cemetery had been, a tall structure of wood stood like a giant tombstone. The land suffered greatly for the changes that were about to occur. The people were cramped in small villages that were caked from the coal dust of the mines, causing lung disease to spread as well as diseases from water contamination. The destruction of their homes, natural beauty, create a stressor for the community. CJ continues, when we arrived at Justice, I jumped down from the train, wobbled along the station platform, and lost my breakfast beside the baggage rack. The connection with the land actually inhabits an identity all of its own. The earth itself takes on living qualities as the mist rises on the mountains. In the unquiet earth, Carrie's son Dylan Freeman is trapped with several miners underground after the collapse of the mine ceiling. He reflects as the earth shifts and groans, that they are in the heart of God's bones. Throughout this novel, Dylan named for a mountain man who moved higher into the hills rather than see the degradation of the land, sees the earth itself as a living, breathing being. Supporting evidence provides the proof of the injustices that the people of Appalachia suffered. Facts can offer support to the prejudice of the region and apply models to explain those in less power and were manipulated and exploited. The colonialism model describes how Appalachian transformed into a coal mining sector by domination from outside sources. And it documents the ways in which outside interests sought to establish their enterprises through political corruption, provides the facts of vulnerability for the region, and can even extend and improve the colonialism model for scholarly analysis, leading to proposal for corrective social action. What this model cannot do is offer a clear understanding or respect for what once was an entirely different culture than the one we believe we understand through the propaganda that we see and hear from credited and official sources. The people of Appalachia were men and women who lived simple lives for generations with structures such as social capital and securities of kinship. Some had odd social quirks that were developed and marked by geographical isolation and often lower standards of education. That is not to say they were not wise, intelligent, or fully capable of enjoying life. Facts and statistics alone cannot offer you this information. It can tell you many things, but it cannot explain how someone feels about being different, having their homes and lives disrupted, and illness and death that came with colonization. It cannot tell you how the manipulation of large companies make the world harsh and cruel without anywhere to go but to take violence and action towards those who stand against your necessity for survival. Denise Gardenia depicts the lives of these generations that suffer under the companies for the black gold that is hidden in the mountains. Coal that will breathe the life force of the steel corporations in the new industrial expansion, only to change the face of Appalachia world forever. Despite the damage caused by flooding, the exploitation of industry and out-of-area corporations, Appalachia have a strong sense of place, home, and family connections. Gardenia makes note of these qualities and of the strength and determination of those who remain in Appalachia. In the unquiet earth, when at the end of a phone call to Jackie, who has left the mountains, Hassel invites her home whenever she decides to come. "We'll still yet be here," he says.